Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence.
All right, folks, welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. I'm your host, as always, Shane Lemaster. We're here via technology with our good friend, Dr. Scott Folkman, for episode number 78. Scott's coming from Spain today, and he's been there for a while working on, is it a fellowship you've been working on?
Yeah, I've been here on a Fulbright scholarship, and I'll be switching to a Marie Curie fellowship here in a few weeks.
Nice. So Scott's working on some big things after completing his PhD last spring 2019. Is that correct? Right?
Actually 2 years ago now.
2 years.
Yeah, because I took a year off to do the bus trip and all that stuff.
Man, time flies.
Yeah.
So first question is always the same, and since you've been on the show and before, just what does Conversations with the Mind mean to you now?
Well, it's interesting because, one of the things I've been doing lately is working with being as much of the observer as possible and working from a place of non-judgment. And I notice the ways that my mind will act somewhat autonomously out of my control. And it seems to kind of happen. And as I've noticed it, like there's an interaction, between my noticing, like, for example, if I pass a judgment, good or bad on anything, I notice it. And then there's an exchange, that's becoming more real time. It's quicker, it's like, as I've developed spiritually and psychologically, it's like I see the ways that I can change my life to be a little bit better and all that stuff. But then, it's been slow. Like there's a long time delay. Now there's a shorter time delay. It's almost like the more I move out of my conscious thinking mind into my heart space, essentially, my intuitive loving space, it's like things just happen more fluidly, and the mind comments. It's a commentator, but it's no longer driving the ship quite as much as it used to be.
I like that description. The mind as a commentator, right? It's sort of like it's narrating the present moment experience. It's like a director, like trying to pick different pathways, or a screenwriter. So you mentioned the mind being sort of like sometimes out of your control, right? Like these thoughts just come out of nowhere. And that's just an interesting concept to me in general. I've heard people talk about, and I kind of ascribe to this framework for consciousness, is that, the brain or the body is just an antenna. It's a receptor, it's full of trillions, every cell has many receptors on it. And so it's like this antenna that picks up on universal frequencies that we can't even feel or perceive, or, the 90% of our body is bacteria, and they're all communicating with the external world at all times. And so sometimes, these thoughts with this idea, they're sort of like, if we're this tuning fork, the ideas are just floating out here in space, and then they come into contact with our tuning fork, and then they just sort of emerge in our brain, right? And we're like, where did that even come from? We can sort of get in trouble if we think that thoughts are facts and just start acting on these data bits of information that are just coming in all the time without a filter.
Right. Yeah, and it's like, you were talking about how we have this input, and then it rises up to consciousness. And one thing I've been really considering a lot lately is the fact that consciousness seems to be an appendage of the psyche, of the totality of the psyche of the human experience. And it's relatively new from an evolutionary standpoint. And if we consider that there's a continuous germline, you know, of sperm to egg, of cell division like that, it's never been broken, ever, in our entire existence as a species, as we've continued to evolve from the most distant ancestors until now. And all of that information is still encoded within the cells and our biology. And all of that is like this bottom up thing where it's like assembled, and we kind of unfold from the egg, you know, as we develop as a fetus, and then we develop and we're born, you know. It's like we're not born as a blank slate. I mean, we have tons of instincts and all of these things together, and then right from the start, you know, we have cultural influence on us, and that just starts to write. You know, it's like our you know, nature versus nurture. It's like, well, those are the same thing, kind of, you know, because it's like our nature is already written into us by the time we're born on a very, very deep level. And then our culture just immediately starts writing on us, and we don't even notice all that. Like, to the point where by the time we are a developed individual and we have like our ego consciousness and awareness of ourself, so much has already been put, so much software and hardware is there already, that it's like what finally comes through to our consciousness has already been filtered through such deep instincts and cultural conditioning that, you know, it's hard for us to make any original thought at all. And I think about that a lot. Like, do I ever have an original thought? Like, can I have an original thought? Because right now it seems to me like my best thoughts, like even my best scientific ideas are at best an amalgamation of what I already know. And it's like, if we're truly generating new knowledge, it's slow. It's slow, very, very slow. And you know, it's like, I don't know how that happens exactly. Like, it doesn't seem clear to me that there's a precise mechanism of that. And I think for most of us, most of the time, our animalistic, instinctual programming overrides our consciousness to such a high degree that, like, most of our existence is bottom up. It's like our whole body is put together, and our mind, our nervous system, all is put together to where when our consciousness finally emerges, I mean, that's the cliche of the tip of the iceberg, right? It's like our consciousness is this thing that we are so focused on. And yet it seems to me, if in my best days, like being able to examine it and be still with myself and observe it, it's like that is just a small part of it. That's the shiniest part, but that's the skin, you know, like that's like when we look at something, that's just the outer layer, you know, but it's like a thin layer of paint on this complex mechanism of an organism.
Yeah, I love what you said about not having an original idea. And there's this quote that's carved into a bench on CSU's campus. You've probably gone by it a bunch of times, and I can't remember the author. I think it's probably Isaac Newton or something like that. But it says,
yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it says, if I've achieved anything in this life, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants, you know. And I love that because it's humbling. It's humbling to embrace that sort of stance, and also it gives respect and veneration to those who came before. So this idea of like being born, and I think most people think of being born as being like this clean slate. Even in a lot of religious traditions, they talk about that, the innocence of the child and things like that. But you're absolutely right. Like, we know from studies such as, you know, that book, The Body Keeps Score, about how the body stores trauma in cells. That happens not only in our own lifetime, but like you said, like we carry ancestral traumas, we carry ancestral lessons learned, right? Like a baby will have automatic programming to avoid certain dangers, or to respond in certain ways to stimuli that will promote survival, right? So these are all ancestral mechanisms that are sort of pre-programmed into the system. And then on top of that is the cultural programming that happens. And depending on your culture, you're going to have a different set of programming. And then even on a higher, like meta level, we have this world, global type programming too. And then beyond that, cosmic programming. So you were using this term programming over and over. And I think that's fascinating because these days I've been thinking a lot about my day-to-day experience of consciousness as simulation, right? Simulation theory. There's a great show out there. I don't know if you've seen it. It's on Hulu called Devs, Devs. And it's a great show. They only have one season. I think it's just a one-season show, but it's about simulation theory, and they create this quantum computer that can all of a sudden predict what's going to happen in the future. It can see back into the past to the actual event. And the viewer can like tap in and see the code come together in this quantum computer projected on a screen. And they start playing around with things like multiple world theory. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, where every possible world is existing at the same time in infinite different iterations. And they're working with like quantum equations and things like that in the show. And it's just fascinating to be able to think a little bit outside the box, right? Like you said, we're so stuck on what is consciousness, but I mean, that's a good question. But beyond that, like just not what is consciousness in this experience, but what is the bigger picture for consciousness? Like what is the construct that all these things are fitting into? What's the bigger picture?
Yeah, so I'm going to pitch a hypothesis or something I've been playing around with, a meta philosophy, if you will, kind of riffing off the idea of the many worlds hypothesis. So with the many worlds, all realities simultaneously coexist. And I like that. And so that, and again, if we go back to what I was talking about, like the bottom up approach, that's kind of sets us up in a deterministic reality where where our instincts and our cultural programming make us do what we're going to do, and we don't have free will. And then like where I'm starting to find that there's this sort of like stroboscopic, like quantum consciousness. That's not a good description of it, but like if we consider that all realities simultaneously coexist with one another, where we can start to see where there is free will, and what I want to describe as more of like a top-down approach to reality, where consciousness is then the dictator of reality, in that when we make a conscious decision, we are like stroboscopically flipping between the many worlds. And like in every moment, it's so fast that we can't see it. It seems continuous. But if we slowed it down enough, it seems possible. I mean, in modern physics, we make an assumption of a space-time continuum. And I don't exactly know the precise reasons why we have made that an assumption. And I've spoken to some other physicists that I know, and I've not received a satisfactory answer why that is. Because when we zoom in enough on everything else, it's all quantum mechanical. So why would space-time not follow the same rules? So if we're flipping between those, like it's like the universe is this like infinite fractal ball with all realities coexisting within it. But I believe that there's it's a unity, right? It's a unity ball. Like it's a non-dual ball. It's all simultaneously coexisting. There's nothing outside of that, because that is everything that is and could possibly be. But I believe that there is a fundamental pull, like there's still a pull from that. And those are like the two paths that we can go by, but in the long run still change the road you're on. It's like, and I think those two poles are harmonic relationship with love and divinity and each other, and self-destruction and annihilation. And it's like in our individual decisions, if we do not make conscious decisions aligned with the universe, we are unconsciously choosing self-destruction. It's like there's a vast ocean of self-destruction that's the ground state of reality. It's like that, the heat death of the universe, like that's inevitable unless the consciousness that arises out of the structure of reality then connects and aligns with all of that, that can push us in a different direction. And there's like a completion process there of where, okay, yes, there's an objective reality where everything's deterministic, but since it all already exists in all potential possible forms, consciousness is the thing that moves through that and mitigates that and travels it. It's like it all already exists, but consciousness is just simply traveling through that and among that.
Yeah. That's the way you described it was beautiful. With these two poles, it reminded me sort of like magnets of the same size. When they come together, they can harmonize so that they can float and overcome like gravity, right? But my question for you is, if there's these two poles, like this giant orb of all possibility with these two poles of opposing force, are those two poles part of the same one larger thing, or are they two distinct things that act on their own volition? My sense is that just like with magnets, like you have two magnets, and classic physics would tell you it's two separate magnets, but then quantum physics would tell you that no, there's no separation, that they're all part of the same quantum field, and therefore they're the same thing. The two opposites are just part of this same quantum magnet.
Yeah. I mean, well, because what's causing the attraction or the repulsion, that's the field. It's like the matter matters, but it only matters because of its distortion in the field. So I mean, on one level of analysis, well, let's say on the absolute scale, the truth with a capital T, it's all the same thing, and there's no difference. And I think there is a strong value to having that analysis, and that's the non-judgment. It's like neither good nor bad, neither accepting nor rejecting, neither pushing or pulling. That's the sort of like Buddhist non-dual state that many of us work towards.
Middle path.
But yeah, and then at the same time, it's like there is a big difference between annihilation and continued existence. It's like in the world of the relative, like it feels like a pretty big difference, and experientially, it feels very different. It's like when one works towards growth, spiritual growth of themselves and others, their life is totally different. And you see it. You see that in the individuals who choose that, and you feel it in yourself if you choose that. And it's like, well, but for me, that's where my kind of next step is. And and I realize that it's almost not a step either, because it's like, okay, yes, I've chosen this path. I've chosen love. I've chosen the expansion of the universe. I want humans to explore the universe forever. I don't think annihilation is a good choice. I've consciously chosen to work towards the continued existence of the harmony of our species with the planet. But then the next phase is like stepping back and be like, okay, if I chose otherwise, that would still be okay. And for the other people who aren't choosing otherwise, on some absolute level, that's still okay. And my judgment is not necessary. And in fact, it's a hindrance to me personally if the people who are not consciously choosing the same thing as me, it hinders me to have a judgment on them and to wish that they were choosing the love. But it's also strange, because if I push that away, that I wish you were loving, and then I'm like, well, no, I want to be non-judgment, then it's sticky. It's a weird thing where it's like, if I push away the judgment, then I'm judging the judgment, and now I'm still judging.
Right. And think about it this way too, with with judging others and recognizing the judgment or others judging you, but especially your actions, right? To judge people, like when we judge others, it hurts us. It's like a form of self-annihilation. It's a form of self-suffering. It degrades our emotions, our mood, our mental state, our physical state, releasing stress hormones, reducing, our immune system, all sorts of things. So in that way, like trying to reduce or eliminate judgment altogether is a form of moving towards that love, right? Because love for self too, hatred, anger, resentment, those all hurt us more than it hurts the person that we're angry and resentful and frustrated with, right? And so if we hold on to like those emotions, like they say, like it's like holding a hot coal expecting the other person to get burned. They don't care, right? It's you that's burning yourself, and that's a choice that you're making to move towards that polar potential of annihilation and self-destruction, right?
Right. And what's tricky too is even positive judgment is still judgment. Saying like, oh, this person's a good person. Well, that's still a judgment. And for me, I mean, one of the big things has been self-judgment of like, and then it becomes a tricky thing to try to navigate in the world, because it's like, if I'm not judging anything, how do I do anything? Like, should I brush my dog? Is that a good thing? And now am I thinking about that as a good thing? And it's like, it's like one of those, it's funny, and I'm trying to be playful with it, and like give myself like trivial things to like decide whether I'm going to judge or not, like whether or not I should brush my dog. Well, it's fine if I do, it's fine if I don't, it's like, but then understanding the karma, if you will, in a simple cause and effect and repercussions. Well, if I brush him, he sheds less in the house. I don't have to sweep later. Well, okay, well, maybe it's easier to do it that way. Like maybe there's a simple harmonic way of doing it that doesn't require self-judgment of good or bad, and then just forgiveness when we don't make the right decisions, or what we think might have been the right decision. And because even what we think was right, that's still a judgment.
Right. And I think judgment serves a purpose. When I first got into Buddhism, I thought it was all about, eliminate the ego, eliminate judgment, eliminate hatred, eliminate anger. But no, it's not about those. It's not about the elimination of anything. It's about the acceptance that those things are just there, and then, working on ways to deal with them in more effective ways, right? So judgment itself holds inherent value in that, you have to make judgments day to day to survive, to stay alive. But you're right on this meta level, like whether I eat today or not, like it's going to be okay either way. Whether I make the judgment to step across the street when the car is coming or not, either way, either decision that I make, it's all going to be okay. I might die, but it's still going to be okay. So there's inherent value in certain judgments. I think where we get caught up is when we start to assign value to the judgments, right? Like this is a good thing or this is a bad thing, because that's completely subjective, and there's no objectivity to that. And then we get caught in our own ideologies and our own conditioning that tells us this is good or this is bad. Because what's good for me might be bad for you, right?
Right. And then, then there's like attachment to outcome, and the difference between doing something specifically for obtaining the fruits of that labor and doing something because it's the right thing to do, or it's like the intuitively right thing to do. Like the cessation of suffering, or not creating unnecessary suffering for others. It's like, well, okay, maybe I want to do that. Maybe I should do all that I possibly can to not create any suffering for anybody else. And obviously I can only do that to some degree, but maybe I should do that to a little bit of a degree. And it's like, but I don't need to do that as a mechanism for receiving any reward. And that's the way, for me at least, that helps me to kind of resolve that non-attachment, and that non-judgment. It's like, and there's a difference between, and then there's discernment, because the discernment is like the more positive aspect of that, like deciding what is appropriate. What is the appropriate action here to reduce suffering for beings, including myself? Like, how do I act in a way that I minimize my suffering, I increase my peace, joy in this world, and then how do I act in such a way that it's true for everybody else? And, that's discernment, and that's a playful way to play the game and not take it so seriously. It's like, save the world and have fun while you're doing it.
Yeah. This talk about reward and doing things for a reward is so, I'm sure it resonates with everybody listening who's listening from a capitalistic based society. It's drilled into us that we should try to achieve to gain certain rewards, right? I can think of even like my jiu-jitsu practice and how it's evolved. And at the beginning, I was certainly seeking physical rewards. And then, now I have to ask myself, who or what is receiving the reward? Well, in the beginning of my jiu-jitsu career, it was pure ego, right? My ego was getting all the reward. My body was getting benefit, things like that. And that's okay, right? The ego is another essential thing that Buddhists don't say you should totally get rid of, but that is a necessary thing, right? And so it's okay for the ego to want that reward. It's okay for the body to want that reward, but there's deeper levels there. And now I think in jiu-jitsu for sure, but in other areas of my life, I'm often seeking rewards that are multifaceted, multi-layered, that benefit not only my earthly existence, but also that benefits others, or that benefits my spiritual self, really. So jiu-jitsu now, sure, I get physical benefit, I get confidence, I get support and family, but I also, I get to work on deeper parts of myself through those challenges and through those struggles. That is for sure untangling karmas that I've been carrying with me,
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because it's like, we talked about the pushing and the pulling, which is such a big part of jiu-jitsu anyway, right? Like, it's like, I mean, so much of spirituality can be just totally encompassed in jiu-jitsu. But it's like, we shouldn't do things because of a reward, but we shouldn't also push them away if they naturally come to us. I've been doing a abundance meditation by Deepak Chopra. I'm not sure if he's the one who founded Naropa, I'm pretty sure, in Boulder. It's like that's been something to work on too. And it's been interesting because it's like accepting abundance into one's life. And that includes material wealth. And it's like, okay, I would accept that, but that's not the goal. It's like, because if we're pushing that away, then that's narrative too. It's like, if we're like, damn this money, like, damn this wealth, like, to hell with all of it. Like, well, that's just your new narrative. It's like, you're still at the same blockage point. It's like accept all of it, just like accept and be with it, but don't cling to it, and that's where that's the dance too. You can't overcommit, because then you're just gonna get thrown, but then you can't be on your heels, because then you're gonna get taken down. It's like you're engaged, you're with it, but you're not too far in either direction. You're centered.
Yeah, I like that. It always goes back to the middle way, this middle place between those poles. And before I take it back to, we've been talking about the individual. I want to go back to the meta here just for a second, because my fascination with reality and consciousness and universe and all these things is consistently blockaded by I guess, the limitations of my own imagination in this sense. And so when you're describing like this giant orb of all possible worlds happening simultaneously, and these two poles sort of pulling individual consciousness to make these pathways through this orb, I can't help but ask, you said big T. The big T in the truth is that those poles are the part of the same thing, that this orb is one giant organism, right? Constantly shifting and moving. I can't help but ask, like, what is that organism? Is it a part of some other larger organism, superorganism, right? Like think about how things are constructed in our known universe, right? Our bodies are macrocosms of smaller microcosms, right? We are systems within systems within systems, from the smallest particle or atom all the way up to the way that our universes are built. So why wouldn't it also make sense for that to be similar on the outside of this multi-world possibility, right? So maybe this is just one cell in a larger cosmic body of multiple worlds. My imagination kind of gets stuck there, and I'm like,
Yeah.
you said there's nothing outside of it because that encompasses everything that exists, but then there's all that empty space that goes into infinity, and that's got to be something, man.
Yeah, well, I'm going to throw this out there because I think this is the truth, and I think that the truth is fundamentally unknowable. I think that we will never have a satisfactory theory or philosophy that explains it. I think even if we are able to create wormholes and travel to other planets and we start to populate the universe, I mean, and where we exist for millennia upon millennia, I think it's the creation is fundamentally mysterious. And that's part of the beauty of it too, is I think it's fundamentally unknowable. But it seems to me that your intuition about, the microcosms of our body, like accumulating to form the macrocosm of us as individuals. I mean, I see the same thing as a human race too. Like we have, it doesn't look like an organism like we do, but our cells don't look like little versions of us. It changes, and it's like as you look at different scales of analysis, you see a different type of entity. And, because there's even subgroups of humanity. We have our individual countries, we have our cultural divides, and we even have our like individual friend groups and cliques. Like those are like little mini organisms, but then they still cohabitate to form one consciousness, one super consciousness that none of us are totally aware of it. And it's kind of schizophrenic right now. It's kind of like glitchy and freaking out, and probably it should be freaking out a little bit right now. Its house is on fire. But if we go up to a bigger scale, we don't know. I mean, what looks like the edge of our knowable universe, I mean, maybe it's empty space over that, but maybe that's just a boundary. Maybe that's the cell wall of this universe. I mean, we don't know. I mean, but the philosophical argument of an infinite reality is essentially like, okay, maybe that's a wall there, right? But if we could even conceptually go up to that wall, there's either nothing beyond it and everything we see is everything that is, or we can go beyond that. And then we just didn't draw the line, wide enough. Our circle wasn't big enough to encompass all of it. But conceptually, we can draw that circle bigger and bigger. And, I consider the possibility that it's not infinite in space, but it's perhaps infinite in form, in that it could be in some bounded finite form, but it's constantly transforming, and there's no edge. Like, it doesn't seem to me like it's like an edge is like this kind of it seems unreasonable to think that there would be an edge to reality.
So
because then
it's not like the Truman Show where you end up at the edge of your world and then you just suddenly emerge into something bigger.
yeah, and it's like there is a conceptual circle that's big enough to include all possible realities in any sort of multiverse. Even if our universe is just a bubble and some other larger thing, we can always conceptually draw a bigger circle until maybe it's an infinitely large circle. And that's how I make the claim that it's fundamentally unknowable, and no amount of time could ever change that for us.
And that's interesting because I definitely I see your point of view, but I think differently on that, and I think it's both. It's fundamentally knowable, I think, because we're a part of it. Right? So Buddhist practitioners, yoga practitioners, meditation practitioners, they all talk about being able to recognize and feel into this oneness that we are already a part of, and sort of tap into that a little bit. And so I think there is a way to fundamentally know all of existence at once, though we might not be capable of doing it in this lifetime. Who knows? In the human form, I don't know if the human body can even handle that, but certainly, they talk about, in the afterlife, you go to this bardo place where you experience all of existence all at one time. And you see it all. You see the big picture, and then that's wiped from your memory when you're born again. But so in those senses, like you can rejoin maybe energetically into that oneness and experience it on a different than human level. But I think it is fundamentally knowable because we are a part of that system, and therefore we have access to that. If only we could figure out how to access it.
Yeah, and it might be a difference in our definition of knowing, because, well, I guess when I was speaking about knowing, I was thinking about in a philosophical, concrete way.
With language or science, there's no way we could know it.
Okay, yeah, but I agree with you that you can have this sort of intuitive alignment with it, and I believe the term is centroversion. It's like you have the external world compelling you, the internal world compelling you. You unite both of them into a totality of a whole. That's being a whole being and fully integrated personality and being, and working in alignment with reality. And we call it divinity. We can call it divinity. We can call it God. We can call it whatever we want. But it's just desiring the highest possible good and working with that, and having humility with it. Just being like, my mind doesn't understand this, but my body seems to. It's like my body responds when I'm in that place. When I take care of myself, when I take care of other people. I have a little garden on my terrace, and it's like I love watching it grow. Just like sitting there, like I just sit out there and just look at my plants sometimes, and it feels good. Like there's just this intuition that helping things grow is the proper alignment, and it just makes everything else easier. It's like there's a sense of ease, and it's like, okay, well, I engage with the challenge, but even engaging with challenge is like with a sense of ease because it's in alignment. That's that sort of harmonic working together, and it's like I don't see that as a utopia necessarily, because we still have to contend with one another, and we still need to be pushing each other. But I think at least our thinking rational minds are quickly at least in my personal experience, is very, very quickly overloaded with the possibilities, and when considering how things are working, because our mind wants to have a mechanism. It wants to know how the watch works, like what's turning the gears back here. And it's just like, that to me is like, well, and that's like the, let's say that's the dilemma of the spiritual scientist, because it's like, as a scientist, I want to know how the watch works. Being spiritual, I know that happens in a place that my mind cannot go. And at least in the existence I have now, I've seen where there's just that edge, and it's like a wall. And my witness, I can witness that other type of experience, but I cannot understand it in the same way that I could understand the way a fuel cell works. But it's like the part of me that, like, it's like if I just become the Egyptian eye, the eye of Horus, if I'm that without thinking, then I could start to see like the ways that reality kind of works, in this sort of like behind the scenes way. But it's like if my rational mind or my ego gets involved, then it's like, then it all kind of, fades away or collapses, because the the narrator starts to explain it, but it's beyond words. It's beyond comprehension of the rational mind.
Yeah, as soon as the mind gets involved, it imposes all of its own limitations on the experience. Limitations of language, of structure, of logic, of philosophy, of all these tools that the mind is great at using, but it's also one of the biggest flaws is that when it's trying to assess an experience for what it is, it's not necessarily all the things that are it's all the things that are looking at it, but at the same time, not individually. Real quick, I don't know. Do you have Netflix out in Spain?
Yeah, we do.
Okay, cool. There's this show. It's a Black Mirror movie called Bandersnatch. Have you seen that? It's really interesting. It's a choose your own adventure movie. So you watch it, and then throughout the movie, it lets you choose your pathway that you want to take. And at certain parts in the movie, this person that you're controlling is telling other people, he's like, I don't know why I'm choosing to do these things. Like, I feel like something else is controlling the decisions that I'm making or the thoughts that I'm having. And it reminded me of what you said in the beginning of, like, sometimes you feel like these messages are just not yours, or they're not coming from you, but sometimes we fall into doing those things. And it's just an interesting movie. You should check that out. Another one is called Adjustment Bureau with Matt Damon, if you haven't seen that. But it's about these sort of angels that work for God that keep people on this deterministic path through life so that reality works. And they have this book that they open up, and it's all the different consciousness pathways, sort of like in a maze shape. And they can trace somebody's pathway through life and see what's going to happen to them. It reminded me of your idea of how consciousness is pulled between the poles, but finds its own route through this orb maze. But I'm having these flashes of things that have been in movies that are sort of symbolic of what you're talking about. It's quite interesting.
Right. Yeah, it's like, well, even that idea that I have is, I'm not convinced that's an original thought. It's like that's at least a vivid amalgamation, or a borderline hallucination. Where I can start to see it or even feel it. Where it's like you can reach certain nonlinear points in your life where it's like, I'm about to make a big decision. Am I going to go to Spain or not? That's going to change my life trajectory for good, what decision I make. And it's like, you can't not make that decision. And that's where I do feel that humanity is developing free will. I think fundamentally we started out not having a free will, and we are slowly developing free will and being able to consciously make those decisions. But it does require a certain amount of untraining, because the low energy pathways and our routines that we do were programmed into us from our culture and from past experiences, past traumas, past habits, and shedding those requires engagement. There is a certain amount of time that will allow these things to passively alleviate. But I do think that's where certain experiences, and meditation in particular, can help us get to that place a little bit faster. You know, we can help ourselves catalyze that experience and start to move towards that more free will. Because if everybody had the conscious choice of deciding whether or not they wanted to make their life as joyful as possible, while simultaneously making everybody else's life as joyful as possible, they would do it. Nobody wouldn't choose that. But the reason why we don't choose that is because we're stuck in our narratives and our pathways. And they're not bad. You know, it's like they're not demons. They're not these, I mean, we characterize them as such, and maybe, you know, maybe it's not such a bad way to describe them, because maybe they act like that, because maybe it's a sub-personality that is part of us. And until we engage with that and integrate it into the whole and love it and forgive it and let it go and then change and evolve, then we're not really consciously making those decisions.
Yeah, well, it's like waking up from the Matrix, but instead of like being unplugged and joining this whole different desolate world, you know, like a movie, the Matrix and the non-Matrix are inhabiting the same space. You just wake up from like the habitual patterning, programming, and you start to shed those things away, unplug yourself from this system of automatic thoughts and automatic behaviors to become more conscientious, more thoughtful and mindful with your thoughts and your behaviors. So I'm wondering for you, like with this, often what I find is that what happens at the meta also happens on the micro level. You know, the universe is fractal in that way, I think. And with this idea that, you know, this big orb of all possible worlds, two poles, pole of self-destructiveness or annihilation, the other pole of love. How do you take that concept, opposing poles, and work it into, or how do you reflect on your own life experience, where you can sort of see that interplay between those two poles, self-destructiveness and love? I know for me, certainly, like in my late teens all the way to my mid-20s, I was in a heavy self-destructive phase, where that's like the only connection to reality I could feel anymore was pain and being self-destructive, and then finding Buddhism and completely shifting to the other side, and now seeking out a path of love instead, and how that bleeds through everything else. So what about for you? Like, how have you navigated those polar opposites?
Well, I can tell you for sure, I have not been perfect with it. I mean, I've definitely acted self-destructively. And, you know, and I'm not even saying that I might not still do that on sometimes, but I think on some level it's an unconsciousness. And the only way to get past that is forgiveness and aiming towards clarity. Like, as an example, I used to drink pretty heavily, like, and pretty much every day of the week. It was like, you know, that was the norm. And it's not like I consciously chose that. And that's when I realized that I wasn't okay with it, is that was the pathway. It was like, I'd get home from work and it'd be like, I'll have a beer. I'll have another beer. We had a kegerator in my living room, and we would, you know, I brewed beer. I still like to brew beer and do stuff like that, but it's like, we had an excess of it, and I was unconsciously choosing that. And the unconscious choice is what led to that sort of more self-destructive behavior. When I started to become more aware of it, you know, if I beat myself up about it, I would still do it. You know, I'd still act in a self-destructive way because, well, I should be punished for how I was acting. I was being a bad boy. I should be punished, you know, like, how else am I going to learn? But the truth is, that's not the right way. That's not an effective approach, at least, because what started to work better was to focus on the things I did want, which was clarity, which was health, love, and creativity. One analogy I often give is when people are mountain biking, if you're biking past a ledge and you look into that ledge while you're biking, you're going to fall into that ledge, or a cactus or some obstacle that's in the way. If you're looking at that, you're going to hit it. And so it's like, you want to acknowledge it. Like if you're going to be hauling ass on a bike and you see a cactus there, like you want to acknowledge that it's there. You don't focus on that. You focus on the trail. You focus on where you want to go. And it's like, you don't deny the things that have gone in the way, but it's like the self-forgiveness is such an integral part. And that's, I think for a lot of people, I think it's the hardest part. I think a lot of people have an easy time forgiving one another. And I've seen that a lot. I've seen that with myself. I easily forgive basically everybody, and it's been a long time since I've had a grudge with any person alive or dead. Like there's nobody I can think of. And even with the most heinous crimes against humanity, those, like, I can start to see how the circumstances of an individual's life might have led them to act in that way. And I ask myself, well, would I be any different? It's like, well, I don't know. I mean, to what degree was I consciously making a decision? Because if I was consciously making a decision, the choice is joy and love, peace, joy, and love. And so it's like, the best I can do is to keep making that decision. And what I run into my own resistance is recognize that it's not my enemy. I'm not going to try to, I can't choke out my old habits. It's like, I won't be able to tap out my own habits because it's me. And so it's like shedding those is an iterative path of forgiveness and patience, self-patience, but it's to some degree discipline too. It's like, but it can be easy, or it gets easier. It seems to have gotten easier when it's just like realizing that, the truth is love. The truth is like working towards that polarity. It's like, what better could I do with my life? It's like, it makes it easy. Like I don't regret decisions anymore, because if I am fully present, maybe I don't have all the information at hand. In fact, I certainly don't. I know I could never have all the information that I have at hand to make the right decision. But if I'm present and I move into like the intuitive heart space, I don't second guess myself as much. It's just like, I make the decision that seems best at that time and just go with it. And it's like, okay, if it's wrong, cool. I'm present now. We can adjust. Like we can wiggle. Like we're gonna dance. It's like it's a wiggle. It's not a, this is the path, we're gonna stay the course. It's like, no, we're gonna wander. Like I don't know. Like maybe we need to go check this out. Like maybe we needed to check this out so we knew this one little crucial tiny little thing. And like in a lot of the areas I look back at my life, and there are parts of me that regret things I've done or otherwise would do differently now. I also recognize simultaneously that I needed to do that. I needed to have that experience so I could learn from that, and then at the same time have learned from that, and then have compassion for people who are in that now. The people that I know in my life that are struggling with addiction, and the other people, because everybody to some degree is experiencing addiction of something. It's like the substance are the most acute forms, like opiates, alcohol, amphetamines, whatever the choice is, like those are the most acute. But man, television, cookies, it's like, yeah, it's all there, and it's like, that's the attachment of Buddhism. And it's like, everybody is addicted to something, and so it's like, how do we get into that place of not pushing, not pulling? Like, sure. And that's the fun part.
What do you say about, because I'm dealing with some, I don't know, this quarantine has been a test for me and some old habits that have been trying to make their way back into my life. And so what do you say about forgiveness when it's used almost as like a bypassing mechanism, right? Where you engage in a habitual behavior, you're conscious of it, you're like, oh, great, I just did that, but I forgive myself, I'll give it a better shot next time. And then you find yourself engaging in it again and being like, oh, I forgive myself, I'll try better next time. What do you say about using forgiveness as a bypass mechanism in that sense?
Well, yeah, I mean, it certainly can be used that way. But I mean, I think the key thing is the consciousness throughout the entirety of the process, and like being like, yeah, well, and there's degrees of consciousness, right? Like, do I really want this? Like, or is this the default behavior? Or is this the habit, or a developing habit? Um, it's like, well, who's making this decision? Is this my programming? Is this the traumas? Like, is this all of that speaking right now? And that's why I'm going to choose to engage in this activity that might not be the best thing for me. It's like, well, then that's when discipline comes in. You know, that's when like the spiritual like warriorship, you know, like having a spiritual discipline is like you have stoicism. You're with that, you know, and it's like I've practiced just being with uncomfortable things, and I mean, you're my jiu-jitsu coach, so like you know how to be with uncomfortable things, and you know, and it's funny because it's like for a lot of us, I think it's easier to be with things that are externally uncomfortable than things that are internally uncomfortable, and you know, that can be the dance. It's like, okay, I've conquered this like external thing. Like I can handle pain, you know, and it's like, and I can do that, and I can engage in these intensely uncomfortable activities. Or for me, one that is often at least a challenge is trying to speak in Spanish and learn Spanish, because I moved here with no Spanish, and nobody in my building even speaks any English. So like that's constantly engaging with me, and like it's uncomfortable. But then it's like, in a lot of ways, I do recognize that is easier than the internal process of like, let's say, deciding whether or not tonight is okay for me to have a drink. Like, okay, am I going to do it tonight? You know, because then there's like, you could self bargain, you know, and then you know, you're right, you could just have a drink every single night, or have a few drinks every night. Like, all right, that's all right, I forgive myself, like, you know, I'll try better next time. But then it's like, well, then I'm not conscious. You know, then it, like the truth is like that decision was made unconsciously. It was done out of a habit, you know, and it was like not because it is okay to have a drink once in a while. And for me, like that's something I can do with friends, and it's something that I like to do. But I think I have a little bit steeper of an edge than most people with that, where like it could easily get out of hand if I'm not consciously deciding whether or not to do that. And so,
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, you know, I think what just popped in my head as something that I think could be useful for myself for sure, but maybe for any listeners out there too, is when we're making decisions that we know have like a habitual history to them, asking yourself, what part of me is benefiting from this right now? Like you said, like, you know, who made that decision to go engage in that behavior? Is it the addiction? Is it the habit? Is it you that made the decision? So asking yourself that question of like, well, what part of me is going to benefit from this activity if I engage in it? Say drinking, for instance. So for me, being a former alcoholic, like that would definitely be the part of me that is benefiting from drinking alcohol, right? It's not going to be my spiritual self. It's not going to be my intellectual self or my athletic self. It's going to be my alcoholic self, you know?
right.
And once you identify like, oh shit, that's who's going to benefit from this. Well, I don't really care about that part of myself too much, or maybe that's the wrong way of saying it, but I don't want to emphasize that part of myself. I'd rather make these other decisions that benefit parts of myself that I'm trying to cultivate. You know, even making decisions with food, for instance, right? Like I can choose to have a salad, or I can choose to have a McDonald's hamburger if they haven't run out of meat yet. But which self benefits from each decision? You know, like my higher self, I just get this intuition that like my higher self benefits from that salad, not just my physical self, but like I feel good after that. But my my craving self, I don't know, my lustful self, the part of me that just wants mouth pleasure, seeks after that double quarter pounder with cheese, but afterwards my spiritual self feels like so guilty and shameful that I even did that, right? So then it's like, who benefited from that? Well, it's this part of me that I don't really want to cultivate. It's not this part of me that I want to identify with anymore. And that's where that conscious decision comes in. Is like, you got to ask yourself the question before you can make a conscious decision of which route to go.
Right. And it's like, well, I had this realization when I was still living in Colorado. I remember I ate a few Girl Scout cookies, and I was like, my mouth really likes these, but nothing else in me likes these. And I was like, you know, I asked myself, I was like, why would I eat Girl Scout cookies? You know, it's like they're about 30 seconds of enjoyment, and then they kind of hurt my stomach afterwards for like an hour or so. And then I know that the long-term health of the rest of my body, nothing's benefiting from it. But I realized it's interesting. You know, it's like you said, like the mouth wants it. You know, it's interesting for the mouth. So it's like it's gratifying in this sort of short-term way. But and that's, you know, and again, that's another form of that attachment. You know, and it's like, so it's like, you know, and that's a lot of the ways that it's like a walking meditation. Like we have to do like a walking meditation past our temptations. You know, it's like before the Buddha reached enlightenment, you know, he covered his eyes, ears, and mouth, and, you know, put his hand on the earth, and the earth is my witness. And, you know, the temptations appeared as a beautiful woman, you know, and like that's the classic motif of temptation. When, at least for males, it is probably one of the highest temptations. And that it does, but it doesn't necessarily need to be so, you know, because, you know, the Buddha had a wife, and we can have these things, you know, it's like, that Tibetan monk Darje, I'm not sure if you met him when he was in Colorado, but we did a lot of work together with meditation and stuff, but he was just telling me this story about how he was hiking this mountain in Hawaii and everything was just so easy. So he decided to just like get a bottle of like alcohol or something, like vodka or something, and he just chugged it. And he was just like, oh, I was just sitting there spinning on the ground. And it was like, and I just had like that image of like the drunken guru, and like Alan Watts always talked about. And it's like, well, that's weird because this guy's like all spiritual and all this stuff, but then he's just like talking about like how he likes to get drunk. And it's like, that's interesting because I don't usually associate those two together, but that's, you know, that's again, that judgment. Like there's that part of me that's decided that drinking is going to get in the way. And so now it will, like, or it can't, you know, if I continue to decide that, like, and it's like, and it, you know, maybe it will, maybe it won't, you know, but it's like, it seems that if the decision is made unconsciously, that's the thing that we want to pay attention to. And even in the act of trying to pay attention to what decisions we're making and what our temptations are, it's like an urban monk. And so instead of going to the mountains, or another example is Ram Dass. When Ram Dass left, he went to India, and he was so spiritually high. He was with his guru all the time, and he felt so connected and divine. And when he came back with his family, he just dropped like that. And he was like, I was just totally back down. I was low. I was depressed. Like all my old habits came back. And it was like, well, because you hadn't cooked those seeds of temptation out yet. And it's like, there's something powerful, I feel like, about being around the temptations, but being able to not engage with them in the same type of way. You know, it's like, if we're still in it so much that if we're near the temptation, we just immediately go for it, well, that's not going to be healthy, you know, especially for a lot of types of addiction. But it's like, well, I've started to realize the more processed carbohydrates I eat, the less well I feel in my body in general. So I've been trying to avoid processed carbohydrates at all, but I live above a bread shop. So every day when I leave my house, it's like pastries, baguettes, and like coffee. And it's like, oh, every day I smell it, but it almost is making it easier now because it's just like a habit of like, I'm tempted by that. And I just recognize it. It's like, oh, look, there it is. And it's just like, there's that feeling. And but it's just a feeling. And like all feelings, it'll pass. It's like, look at, and then on the observer, I pay attention. I look at myself wanting bread, and then I look at another part of myself being like, hey, if you don't buy that, you'll feel a lot better. If you go buy that right now, you're going to be lethargic and you're going to like have like, it's funny. Like, I'm not sure what it is. Like if it's gluten or what exactly it is. But if I eat bread now, it's like, I have like tension in my back and neck, and I'm like just overall less energetic. So, but it's interesting because it's delicious bread, and it's like, it's not something I want to just give up for no reason. But I'm realizing that even though the taste is interesting and the indulgence is interesting, it's at least different from the norm.
Well, I'm pretty sure that like breads and wheats and things like that promote inflammation in the body. Which can, contribute to tension and those aches and pains and just not feeling good. And I think there's this famous monk, I believe it's Thich Nhat Hanh, but I could be naming the wrong monk, but he was really famous for coming to the West, dressing in Western suits. He was an outward alcoholic, so he would drink all the time and get drunk. And yet he's like this esteemed monk that's publishing really important books on meditation and Buddhism and things. And the way that I read about him, and he took a similar approach than what you're describing as the monk that you knew who got drunk, is like, this was a part of his practice. This was a conscious decision that he made to engage in, just like a monk saying, I'm going to go spend 10 years up in a cave meditating. This monk said, no, I'm going to spend, however many years in America living like an American, wearing the suits, engaging in alcoholic behaviors and things like that. And then I just think that that's interesting that everything can be done consciously, including alcoholism, and that monks can do this stuff too. What you're saying reminds me of, as far as like making choices, like for me, I think I need to focus more on delineating between like, is this decision for short-term benefit or long-term benefit? And the way that I think, like if I chose more often for the long-term benefit choice, I think it would probably benefit me in the short-term most often as well. Whereas if I pick for the short-term benefit, it quite often negatively impacts my long-term goals, right? So if I'm choosing, to eat that fast food or to engage in some laziness or something because it's good for me short-term, how's that going to affect my long-term self? Whereas, I'm in the same situation and I think, well, what is my long-term goal? It's to, be healthier, to live a long life. Therefore, I'm going to choose the healthier option. I'm not going to be lazy. I'm going to go for a walk. That ends up benefiting me in the short term as well, even though the focus is on the long term.
Right.
The problem with that right now, I think, for me, is that this whole COVID thing that happened and the words that they use in the media, like pandemic and like, global deaths and like, it throws us all into like this survival mode, right? At least a little bit, right? I mean, for practitioners like you and I, we can distance ourselves a little bit and observe it and not engage in it, but it still puts us in a bit of survival mode where we don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know, anything about this thing. And so it seems like when we're in this survival mode, for me anyway, like my mind just shifts automatically to short term, right? So I don't know if I'm going to be alive in 3 years because we don't know shit about this disease. And it just brings a lot of things to light, right? Like this may be pandemic junior to something that's coming down the pike, right? So I don't know if I'm going to be around in 10 years. Therefore, I'm going to engage in what I want to do right now because, I'm in survival mode. Does that make sense? Instead of looking long,
Yeah.
like I don't have to worry about survival, I'll be here a long time. Therefore, I can focus on long-term goals. Now I'm just like I'm hit with this immediate reality and I'm stuck in, it's weird. It's like I'm stuck in the present moment and it's hard for me to see beyond the unknowing with this COVID thing.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of goes back to the doing the right thing or doing the appropriate thing without being attached to the results. Like, it's almost like living in layers. Like, everything we do is in the present moment, always. Whether our consciousness is with us in the present moment is a different story. Maybe it's fantasizing about something else. Maybe it's fantasizing about hamburger or something like that. And yet the potential of the future self is always there. And, I've reflected more on the experience I had as dying as a stingray, when I was living in the bus, like that experience where I saw myself die as a stingray and felt what it's like to have a transpersonal existence, or what that is, because it's not me per se. It lives within me and it lives within you as well, but it's not identified with us. That superorganism, if you will still benefit from us living in a healthy way. And removing our blockages from access to that state of consciousness it's more about removing things from ourself. It's like there's a lot of times I feel like, especially in the West, we're so focused on additive. It's like we're on additive synthesis. Like I need this, this pill or this drug to make me feel good. I need anti-anxiety medication. I want a car.
I need a boob job.
Yeah, like I want this shirt, like whatever it is, and I don't deny that I sometimes feel that way too. It's part of the cultural programming. So it's like, it's deep in all of us. But there's also the truth that in order to get to that enlightened state, or at least more aware, like it's at least to some degree of a transpersonal awareness of the repercussions of all of our actions. If we start to think of that, the totality orb again, where we make those decisions, like every decision, what we decide to eat is going to move that whole thing, and that's one of the more profound concepts in this philosophy for me, is that like no person is exempt from that. And we're all individually contributing to where that ends up. And so it's like our personal decisions are universally important in ways that we can't, at least our conscious mind cannot understand it. But like, so, I mean, when we make that decision, if I'm at the grocery store and I'm like deciding what I'm going to buy, making the decision to not buy farm-raised meat or not buy food made with palm oil. Palm oil is one of the biggest reasons for destruction of the rainforest. They put it in fucking everything. You have to go way out of your way to find food that doesn't have palm oil in it. And it's like, but if we make that conscious decision, and if all of us did that, we would stop cutting down the rainforest. But I think it's more profound than that, because there are nonlinear effects that we cannot understand. I mean, there's the simple truth that if we all stopped eating palm oil, we'd stop cutting down the rainforest to produce palm oil. That's true, but I believe that there's a more profound long-term truth from that, where I personally will not see the consequences, nor will you personally see the consequences of the choices that we make right now in this lifetime, and what those repercussions might have for future generations. We just cannot know that. I mean, it's totally unpredictable.
Yeah, I love this idea of stripping away, because it's both foreign to our culture, but it's also deeply ingrained, because I can think of ancient Roman or Greek sculpture artists, right, who would talk about the artwork or the sculpture emerging from the chipping away of the stone, right, and then the sculpture, this pure perfect form, emerges from this chunk of granite or whatever. And then we've sort of lost that in our common or our contemporary culture, where, like you said, it's additive. It's like, what can I add to myself or to my life that is going to make me happy, that's going to make me whole? Well, Elon Musk was just on Joe Rogan again recently, and he said that he is planning on just stripping away and minimizing all of his possessions, so that he's just going to be living with his family in a rental. This multi-billionaire is going to live in a rental, right, and have like a couple of Teslas because his name's on it, and that's about it. He said that all of those possessions that he had were attack vectors. That's the term he used. These are attack vectors. And the way he was talking about it was like, these are ways that media or that other people can attack him and say, you're not that good of a person. You have all these possessions when there's starving people out there and you could be helping others, right? So that was his reasoning behind it. But I think his terminology is spot on and goes a bit deeper. He's probably thought of this too, because he's a freaking genius. But it's an attack vector, just like in Buddhism, where you have attachments to material and other things, right? People, materials. And these become attack vectors for your own enlightenment, right? So this is attacking your opportunity to experience wholeness, oneness, true happiness. They're barriers, right? And they can be targets for you to try and eliminate, so that you can, live more into that minimalistic type of life. I'm sure when you were in the bus, you felt that connection a lot more than you do now living in an apartment in Spain.
Well, it's interesting. Well, certainly living in the bus got me on that, and the appreciation of minimalism, and the realization that I brought way more shit than I needed, both literally and metaphorically. And I started to see how my habits and my conceptions of self and my self-definition are just baggage, just weight that you don't really need, but the other, like the completion picture, that to me looks like being able to have the possessions and not be attached to them in the same way. It's almost like me living in the bus was like a stripping away, and to some degrees I'm still stripping away, but it's like, and that's like the phoenix, right? Like the phoenix has to burn, the dead wood has to burn away for the new thing to be created out of it. But it's like, after a certain point, it seems like the goal is to transform. The goal is not just to transform. Of course, we need to transform, but the goal is to transform into the thing that continuously transforms. Or like, that's like the meta goal. That's like the goal of goals. Like that's the ultimate in alchemy and transmutation, is like to be in that state of continuous transformation. And it's like, and it's like, and I've been thinking of this idea of like, and this is an old motif, is humans as shepherds, and even seeing us as shepherds of our possessions. Like, I've bought a bunch of music equipment here in Spain, and I wasn't expecting that. Like, I was not expecting to be on lockdown for several months, obviously. But now I've bought a bunch of stuff here because getting it shipped from the US is basically impossible. And now it's like, now I have all these things, but will I fly them back to the United States? Probably not. But are they useful to me now? Yes. Am I glad I have them? Yes. But it's not they're the means to an end. And at the end of it, I'll let go. And I don't know if I told you, but I sold the school bus. And that was something that was a tricky internal process for me, because I had so many positive associations with that. I bought the bus from one of my best friends, had such a long history. I wanted to sell it to someone I knew. and then I ended up selling it to someone I met on Facebook who was essentially homeless at the time. They offered it to me for less than half of what I was selling it at. And their friend was able to get them money together to where they could meet me halfway between what I was offering and what they were offering. And, you know, and I recognized, it was like, I would love to continue to keep this in my possession, but it's a disservice to that memory to just like leave it in a lot somewhere with my name on it. You know, I'm not using it. I'd be paying for it. I'd be paying insurance on it and have it registered, and it would just decay there. Whereas I could sell it. I could have a liquidated asset, and then someone else could be using it. It was like, well, that's the right thing to do. And so it's like, but I had to have the possession first, you know, and it's like this, and it's like this continual cycling of the possessions and like welcoming them in, welcoming them to leave. You know, it's like, you can come in, you can go, it's all fine, you know, and it's like, because at points I was definitely like, I don't want possessions. Like, I'm a pseudo socialist, you know, like there's too much greed and too much wealth, you know, and don't get me wrong, there's too much wealth inequality, but I don't think that wealth itself is necessarily the cause of the suffering. It's the attachment to the wealth. And because then when that becomes an ego narrative, then that's when it's an addiction. You have these CEOs of pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies and all these companies where they just want more. There's more and more wealth. And that is a grotesque addiction to me. And that is the type of thing that bleeds the rest of us, you know, and that's the thing where it's like, if they were consciously aware of the truth with a capital T, and they were aware of their union with the rest of the beings on this planet, they would not make that choice. And I don't damn them for the choice that they're making, because the choices that they make is out of ignorance. They're not awakened to a large degree of their state. And if they are, there's cognitive dissonance, and they repress that. They keep it down, because that's the only way you could imagine individuals accumulating more than a few million, but certainly the people up in the billions area. It's like, that's not serving them any.
Yeah. So you grew up in the U.S., you know our culture forward and backward, and now you're in Spain, which is a different culture, but it's a far older system, older culture than the U.S. that's gone through a lot of the things that the U.S. is currently going through and made it out the other side in different ways. I'm wondering, like, how do you, being an American, how do you sit in Spain, and how do you observe how they do things, as opposed to, you know, this. I mean, in the U.S., it's, you know, stereotypical capitalistic billionaires, you know, elites, and then the extreme poor and the dying middle class, and that's how it is in America. What's it like in a culture like Spain that's far older and that has probably been through those stages already?
Well, I mean, I can only speak from the experience that I have, and. Well, I mean, I have friends here that are from South America, and I've spoken with them at great length about the politics of what's going on in their home countries, what's going on here. And in a lot of ways, it's archetypal. I mean, it's like the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, where systems and institutions tend to become more powerful. As they get more power, they want more power, they create more power, and they take more power, and they also simultaneously tend to become corrupt. And the people within them become established within the state. I mean, it's like Star Wars, where Anakin Skywalker was supposed to be the chosen one, but then this leader within the institution corrupted him, and he became the evil father. You know, that's a very archetypal story. And I do think a lot of politicians start with that intention, but I think the natural course of unrenewed, at least, institution is towards corruption, at least to some degree, if it's not mitigated somehow. And there does seem to be degrees of that here as well, and throughout the world. I mean, it seems to be more of the commonplace the more I learn about other countries and other places throughout the world, that there is some degree of corruption, or at least a vast disparity in ideas of what most people in a given area want and what is accomplished by the institutional elite in the established government and the oligarchs of the business class as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've been to Europe a couple times and never spent enough time there to really have enough time to collect enough observational data to really make a distinction between U.S. politics and European politics, even though I know about the different systems, parliamentary systems, and the old guard, kings and queens and all that stuff over there, sort of ceremonial instead. But it's interesting because, sorry, I'm just trying to formulate my thoughts here, where I want to go with this. There's so many different directions. I think I'm going to throw a curveball at you first. So amidst this COVID pandemic, there's all sorts of conspiracy theories flying around about why it's happened and all that stuff. But what's really frightening to me is some of the political actions that have taken place during the pandemic, that because of the pandemic fly under the radar, and so American citizens are unaware of some of these things happening. Like, they passed another bill renewing parts of the Patriot Act, giving the FBI full access to everybody's internet search histories without a warrant. That was passed. Another thing that came out, which I don't know how this flew under the radar because we've been waiting so long, but I think it was the CIA released footage of UFOs, that they had caught on radar, and they had explanations that they didn't know what they were, and they were not from this world, and that flew under the radar, right? So aliens have been announced, that they've officially been announced. And something interesting came up the other day. I was listening to a podcast, and they were talking about why would aliens come to a planet to sort of welcome us into an intergalactic parliament or something, unless we were all unified, right? Why would any galactic body want a disunified planet to join their ranks? And this is just an interesting thought for me because of all this UFO that stuff came out. Like my mind is on aliens a lot these days, and I've always thought that they're already here walking around us, that we're probably aliens ourselves. But like this classic form of the gray aliens and the UFOs, and how they might be ambassadors just trying to check on our planet. They're just waiting for us to overcome these power grabs that you're describing, so that we can unify at least under one global cause, and then all of a sudden we'll be welcomed into this much larger galactic body that we're just unaware of. Have you ever seen what is it, Hitchhiker's Galaxy? Or
yeah, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah, just like that, right? Where they come in and just build a highway right through the earth, and nobody is even aware that aliens exist, and sort of like that. I thought that was an interesting thing. So sorry for the curveball, but with with all this COVID stuff going on, and politics doing its thing and sliding things under our nose, that's another aspect that I don't think people are paying much attention to.
Yeah, I mean, well, you think about contact tracing, and it's like, all right, if we take a broad stroke and we just look at people's cell phone data and how much they're moving in an area, that's not super useful. Like, you can get that from traffic light data. Like, you don't need cell phone data for that. But if you want to know, did individual X come into contact with individual Y within this given time frame, then you have to have fine data of where each individual is going and their personal information and who they're in person and their proximity. And that level of analysis is a gross invasion of privacy. And I am not sure how close we are in the United States to doing that. I'm sure it's not far away. But you are absolutely right to bring up and to be speculative about how much surveillance is being passed now to be done legally on citizens that it's like is not necessary and in no way would fight the virus. You know, it's like the lockdown is a last ditch effort for us to contain the spread for as slowly as possible so we can develop a vaccine and stuff. It's like if we had effective testing right up front, it wouldn't have been necessary. But I mean, again, I go back to my statement of power corrupts, and it's like, you know, we hand this over, which, you know, we have to, like, we had no other choice. You know, it's like you look at what's happening in Italy or New York, or I mean, Barcelona and Madrid were pretty bad. Where I live, it hasn't been bad. There haven't been that many cases. But we didn't have fine enough of a structure to be able to lock down only certain areas and open up others. And, you know, like what we're seeing with everybody opening back up in the United States so rapidly without the testing that we need to do that intelligently, it's very, very likely we'll start to have spikes. If people obey the social distancing and the masks and stuff, it'll be slowed. And maybe that's good enough. I mean, we don't know. It's an experiment. I mean, it's certainly an interesting experiment that the United States is doing right now to open up so quickly, and it'll be interesting to see those repercussions. But yeah, it's been clear that the integrity of the privacy of the individual has been continuously eroding for at least the last 20 years. Probably longer than that. The history that I know of is about 20 years, but I'm sure it's been eroding longer than that. But it's that slow turning of time where it's just like we've been sleeping. I mean, as the people of the country, we've been asleep. We've just been kind of letting it happen because we've had prosperity, and we haven't thought to think about where our prosperity comes from. Why is oil cheaper in the United States than anywhere else in the world? Why are our goods so much cheaper? Why do we have such a big wealth gap between the United States and the rest of the world? And then why is there such a steep wealth gap within the United States? And, you know, people, you know, it's inconvenient to question those types of things, and it's difficult. It's very, very difficult, and it's not reported in a large scale. But, you know, in some sense, you reap what you sow, and our ignorance to the global economics associated with the way that we acquire oil and goods from other countries, and the growth of China as a world power. I mean, one of the biggest reasons why the United States has been such a huge economic market is because we had such a strong consumer base. But that's shifting. I mean, and that's been shifting swiftly and consistently. And the consumer base in China is becoming very, very strong. And a lot of companies are now starting to look at China as the economic consumer base of the world. Mm. And it's like, we have not been paying attention. And a lot of stuff has been slipping out of our hands. And we will, you know, I mean, we will need a Phoenix type moment. And I don't know what that looks like. I'm not saying anybody should start a fire, but we will need a renewal to our system and our politics if we don't want complete catastrophic collapse.
Yeah, and you know, this Phoenix thing, if I'm interpreting it right, you're talking about just like one massive event that affects the entire globe so that we all rise from the ashes together, unified.
Yeah, I mean, we can do it slowly too. You know, that's the thing, is it doesn't have to be painful. You know, it's like, it's only painful when our eyes are closed and we are running at full speed and we hit a wall. That's when it's painful. If we take a breath and we slow down, we think about it, it doesn't need to be painful. You know, like I mean, one simple thing that could be done that would really start to change things in a big way in the United States is campaign finance reform. You know, it's like if it wasn't secret donors using super PACs to slit money into the pockets of politicians without everybody not knowing where that money came from, you know, and basically buying politicians, that would fix a lot of things. You know, if we had term limits, that would fix things in a big way because we'd have fresh blood constantly coming through. We couldn't have these career politicians who figure out the best way to maintain power, because like to stay in office, you don't come up with the best policies for the people. You come up with the best policies for keeping you in power. And if they were forced out, they would just end up, and they were forced to make a choice of what's going to be morally best for them, and they were going to be out of office in 4 years anyway, or 8 years anyway, they would make a lot more decisions that were going to be good for people rather than what's good for themselves. And we could do that. I mean, as a nation, there are ways. The founding fathers created ways for us to do that as a people, to make those sort of amendments where we start to make those decisions. And we could do that, and I hope we do, because that's a lot better than us running headlong into a wall. Because that will be painful, and that will be a tragedy. I mean, a global tragedy if we don't fix it conscientiously now. You know, and it's that kind of the same deal. Like, are we going to decide to have a hamburger, or are we going to decide to have a salad? Because if we decide to have a salad now, and we make the right choice now, we feel better later. But maybe we're going to hit this, we're all going to keep eating hamburgers. We're going to have this like easy street kind of mentality of like, I want things to just be the way they were. And like, I want to eat hamburgers the rest of my life. It's like, nah, well, you're going to hit a wall and it's going to hurt. And then you have to backtrack from that. You have to backtrack from that and then eat the salad anyway. You have to make the right decision in the long run anyway. But it doesn't have to be painful if we do it from a place of conscientiousness and love. Like, we make that decision now, and we put in the legwork up front, and it doesn't have to be painful.
And there's a lot of people going for the hamburger right now. Here in the U.S., we all got like this $1,200 stimulus BS, which is, you know, ridiculous. But man, people are spending their checks in interesting ways. Like, I drive through Fort Collins, and almost all businesses are closed, and yet Cane's Chicken has a line of cars that literally goes from, you know, it goes like 4 blocks down the main thoroughfare, blocking off an entire lane of traffic. It's ridiculous, you know. So people are going for the easy street and back to their habitual patterns, and the decisions that are being made are certainly not making it easy for people to realize, like, this is a wake-up call. I'm wondering, what is COVID, what has your experience been like in Spain? I know that Spain handled it a little differently. You guys have had more deaths than we have, but it sounds like you guys have not started to reopen the way that we have. Is that correct?
We have started to reopen. We are finishing phase 1. We started with phase 0. We went into phase 1, and next week is phase 2. So businesses have been open, and you're supposed to wear a mask. I have 2 masks. You're supposed to wear a mask if you're out in public and you cannot maintain social distancing. So at the street market, I wear a mask, but they opened the street market. That hasn't been open in months. That opened for the first time last week. So that is something that it's opening back up. My work institution is open. I personally have not been able to go back to work because of my visa, which is a whole nother issue. But things are opening here. And one could make the argument that, well, you know, technologically, we're not quite there yet. But you could imagine that in 10 years, the standard is for every country and every hospital in the world to be able to have the type of testing that we would need for any novel virus that comes out, where we could test for it. And places don't really need to shut down. Like where I'm from, we probably didn't need to ever shut down. because it was just never that bad here. But it would have gotten that bad if we didn't shut down. But if we had the type of tracing and the effective treatments for it, we would have never had to shut down. And same is true with the United States. It's a technological challenge, but but there's psychological reasons why we didn't have the technology ready. Like we could have had the technology ready like 10 years ago to be able to beat this, but we didn't. And it's that same thing. It's like there's a time delay between our decisions and the consequences of those. It's simple cause and effect, but that's also the karma of like we didn't prepare for this as a species. I mean, some countries are more prepared than others, that's for sure. And Spain's opening up. I think they're doing it at the right pace for where we're at in terms of technology and access to resources. So, everything in good time, but hopefully we learn from this and we stock up with it. I'm actually starting a research project to test for the antibodies and the virus directly using electrochemistry, because we want to be my vision is to have a test that is very rapid. If we are able to develop this using electrochemistry instead of PCR based techniques, we can test for the virus and have the results within a minute or so. So instead of waiting a day, you get your result in a minute. And ideally, it'd be nice to have something that's paper-based or something like that, where it's disposable. But that's a long-term project.
You're talking about technology and testing, and you shared this with me because of my affinity for all things psychedelics and especially my favorite LSD. But you shared with me this interesting tidbit of information I was hoping you could share with the audience about how COVID testing could not even be possible had it not been for contributions of LSD to like the discovery of DNA and DNA sequencing and things like that, right? Because isn't that how the testing?
Yeah. So, gosh, I forget what year he won the Nobel Prize. It was in the 90s. But this guy named Kary Mullis was, I believe he got his PhD from Berkeley in biochemistry. But he was working at a lab and he developed this technique called polymerase chain reaction. It's super neat. You have DNA, right? It's the double helix. But what you do is you heat up to basically boiling to where the helix unwinds and it breaks apart. Or you get it to where it's about to break apart. Because if it breaks apart totally, you just destroy the DNA. But you then add enzymes that are stable at that temperature. And then you add like these, they're called primers, where you can start the replication and you're able to very, very specifically amplify certain parts of the genome or the DNA sequence and analyze the DNA in a very elegant fashion. And you're able to sequence the DNA in such a way. But he claims that he developed the idea while he was under the influence of LSD. And in an interview with Albert Hoffman, he says that he does not believe he could have come up with that idea unless he had taken LSD, which is very interesting to think that is a contributor to this science, even this area, and all genetic sequencing uses PCR. So every time we look for any sort of genetic disease that a person might have, anytime we do a genetic modification of anything, we're using PCR, and PCR is ubiquitous in labs across the world. They do it in undergraduate labs, and that's what they're using. And that's actually been one of the interesting things about when they're testing for the virus too, is because you can use PCR, and that's where a lot of the conflicting information about how long the virus lives is. They're like, oh, the virus can live for days on metal or something like that, but it's like, a lot of those tests, they just did PCR and they confirmed that the genetic material was still present there. That doesn't necessarily mean that the virus is still viable and can infect. And that's actually a lot more difficult of an experiment to do. So whereas a lot of agencies were claiming that it could live this long or that long, a lot of the times they were using techniques that were only sensitive to, is the genetic material there or not, and not necessarily, is the virus still viable and able to infect. And the truth is, it lives a lot shorter on most surfaces, and it's a lot less viable than a lot of the information that has been spread about it. It's definitely not days. It seems more like hours.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, thank goodness for Albert Hofmann and the discovery of LSD and all the contributions to science that have come from these altered states where people's brains and synapses open up and are able to receive, these ideas that are floating out in space, or just come across our tuning forks. So thank goodness for that. Or else we wouldn't have any testing, like you said. That'd be really intense. Last thing I want to talk to you about is yoga, because you're a yoga teacher, and I have dabbled in yoga in the past as a form of just stretching or, relaxing, things like that. But now I'm at a phase in my athletic career where I'm reaching the end of my 30s. I'm not going to be able to go as hard as I originally went in my 20s. And I'm sort of switching into this mode of less force and more flow into my life, into my jiu-jitsu, into my academics, into everything in my life. And in order to do that, I was actually told this by a medicine woman who told me, you need to start a yoga practice. And that's the thing. It's like I've dabbled in it, but I've never established a practice of it. And for others out there too who might be interested in incorporating yoga, because it's so beneficial to our higher selves and our physical selves, I'm wondering, like, what would you suggest for someone like myself who wants it but doesn't know how to establish a practice around it? Where would I even start? What types of yoga would I go for? Should I start with lower duration and build up? Like, how do you go about establishing the practice?
Well, it's different for every person. As the most accurate answer I could give, for me, I went for the all-you-can-eat buffet first. I just tried everything. I've done Bikram, Yin, and I like that because what I found is I like all of them, and I like certain ones for certain days. Going, like, if it's the middle of the winter in Fort Collins, and you go to a Bikram yoga class, and it's those are like an hour and a half, or Bikram style or whatever, where it's like a hot class for an hour and a half. That can feel really good, and because you've been cold constantly for weeks. And you go on there and you just sweat, and you stretch and you open everything up. Your body's more stretchy in general when you're hot. So, I mean, it can feel really good to do that. But it's not that restorative. I mean, it can be super intense. You can get a lot of muscle tone from it. But I would encourage exploration. It's like there's a ton of free stuff on YouTube. In addition to my stuff, which I think you said you're going to add a link to that. I'll send you that.
Yeah, say what the name of the channel is.
The name of the channel is ThisYogaJourney. And right now, I haven't put out an episode in a couple weeks because I've been getting back to my norm, but I think I'm going to start trying to teach on weekends again and I've been doing the live stream on yoga. That seems to be pretty fun, or a live stream on YouTube. And, the word yoga translates to unity or union. And the yoga practice that what we all think of is the asanas. And that's the poses you do on the yoga mat. That's the stretches and the exercise. That's actually only one of the aspects of it. And that's okay that we think of it that way too. It's an incomplete knowledge of what yoga is. So it's common for people to think that that's all there is to it. There's a lot more to it. And meditation is a big part of that as well. And it's very closely related in a lot of ways to Buddhism, and that path, that middle path, and right mind, all that, the Eightfold Path. And so one thing I've really come to realize is that there are the asanas that are traditionally taught in yoga, warrior two, triangle pose, and all of those that we traditionally do. But there is also a accessibility of yoga when we're off the yoga mat. And if I'm really in tune with myself and I'm connected, I can be doing yoga while I'm in lab. I could be driving the bus or riding my bike, and it could be a yoga experience. If my breath, the breath is a huge connection to that. And it's like when we think about simple ways of us connecting to union, the simplest thing is that we are in control of, that is close to that, is the breath. It's in and out. It's polar, it's in and out. But there's also a union to that. There's like there's the wave, there's the wave, but the oscillations, we could think of it as a standing wave. It's still all there. And that breath, the awareness of the breath, and the observation of the mind in a sort of meditative sense, that to me is almost more yoga than just doing the poses. Because some days I'm just farting around, I just do some stretches just because I want to stretch. And there is a difference to me between stretching and exercise and exploring yoga as a spiritual practice. But I do think there's value in trying a lot of things, that's the way I've lived my life. I've tried a lot of things. And so, eventually we get to the point where we find what works in our bodies, and, what doesn't work quite as well in our bodies. And then we develop discernment, and we work with the ones that take us best towards that pole of harmony and love, I would say.
I like that. That's really helpful. I mean, it's difficult right now to get hot yoga in with everywhere closed, unless I put up like a reflective tent and did it inside there or something. I need a spotter for that probably. But the way that you put it, these asanas as just being different components of this larger system makes a lot of sense when I overlay jiu-jitsu again, because my mind is jiu-jitsu, overlay that too. It's like when you start jiu-jitsu, you think that there's one way to do it, but the longer you stay in it, you realize that, oh no, there's all these different systems, right? There's worm guard, there's de la hiba, there's there's spider guard, there's all these different systems that within themselves are complete systems, but then are also individual components of this much larger thing called jiu-jitsu.
Right.
And for me, like you said, like I could be doing jiu-jitsu when I'm driving down the street, right? I could be doing jiu-jitsu, verbal jiu-jitsu in a conversation with somebody or a debate,
sure.
Right? And so in that sense, I understand what you mean by like yoga. You have these yoga experiences outside of the actual stretching practice. So I can see parallels there. And I think I'm just going to go explore, like you said, and try out a bunch of different kinds and just see which ones serve my needs, which ones work for my body with my injuries, that it's not like I have to pick the right one, it's the right one for me.
Right.
It's interesting, I have this subscription to a website called Yoga for BJJ, and he puts out a bunch of flows, but he also puts out a lot of restorative yoga for specific jiu-jitsu injuries to help recovery process. And I was doing an hour-long yoga yesterday, because yesterday I started my practice.
Nice.
And he had us doing this variation of a warrior pose I'd never done before called Flying Warrior. Have you ever done that one?
A lot of people come up with their own names. Right. I'd have to see it.
Yeah, so it's like a warrior two pose where your arms are outstretched, except you rock up onto just the front foot and you extend both directions, but balancing on one foot. He called it Flying Warrior. And just like little things that he does with like the jiu-jitsu belt as a prop help keep me connected to what I'm familiar with and what I am passionate about. You know, I'm holding my most prized possession because it represents all this anguish and challenge and overcoming it. But also I'm using it in a brand new practice for me that is unfamiliar and uncomfortable. So yeah, thank you for your advice on that. I think that's going to be super helpful.
Yeah, you know, and it does take courage to go do things like that. I've had a few like more private sessions where people have come to my apartment and done yoga here, and you know, I'm always grateful when people show up to it, especially if they've never done it before and they don't know what they're getting into. I mean, it does take courage, you know, and it's like, I mean, it's the same thing with like learning to swing dance or learning to salsa, you know, it's like, you're not going to know how to do it at first and it's going to feel awkward, you know, but it's like all things that are graceful start awkward. You know, you look at the people who are just like, I mean, I love watching figure skating and it's like, it's amazing, and gymnastics too. But figure skating to me is particularly graceful. But when you see someone their first time on the ice, they are particularly ungraceful. And all things start like that. You know, even now when I'm learning new things on music, like if I'm learning something new, it does not sound good until it's been iterated, you know, and it's like, I mean, it's a transformative process to do that, you know, and it's like, and I found the same is true with speaking from the heart. Like a lot of times it can feel awkward to speak from the heart to one person, especially when disclosing uncomfortable truths or asking uncomfortable questions. You know, it feels awkward at first, but with practice, it becomes natural and can be done very skillfully. And the yoga practice is one where I think, in particular for males in Western society, you know, we're taught to be tough, you know, manly men, you know, growing up, and it's just like, well, you know, maybe I want to explore my peaceful side. You know, maybe I do want to get sprayed with some lavender scent as I'm like laying down and relaxing. Like maybe I do want to take a bubble bath with candles and stuff like that. And so, you know, and because we can have both, you know, there's no reason we can't have both. And I'm finding more and more that as I allow myself to be a delicate little flower, you know, I'm gardening now and I have a bunch of flowers on my deck. And it's like, as I let myself be that, it's like, that does not diminish the warrior part of me. Like my mental resilience and my physical resilience and my ability to engage with it is by no means lessened at all. And in fact, in a lot of ways, it's greater because there's less gripping. You know, like the first few times I competed in BJJ, I just blew out my forearms right away because I was just gripping, you know, and it's like, now it's like, I can be gentle. Like we can do BJJ, I'm going to be gentle. And actually, I don't know, you might know this already, but the word Jiu-Jitsu actually comes from, they believe the Japanese word for gentle movement.
Gentle art.
Gentle art. Okay. Yeah. Which makes a lot of sense, you know, it's like, cause you can do it very smoothly and it's like,
more effective when you do it smoothly.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, it's funny to see the places where it actually, if we think about it and we acknowledge it, it takes courage. Or even me getting a haircut here in Spain. Like I had to get up some courage for a while to decide like, all right, I'm going to show up to this hairdresser. They're not going to speak English probably. They didn't. And I'm going to have a hard time conveying exactly how I want my haircut and all this stuff. So it's like, I realized the reason why I had been putting it off was because I was nervous about it. And I was like, well, you know, once I recognized like it was going to just take a little bit of courage, I was like, I have courage. Like I can do this. And of course it wasn't a big deal, you know, and it's like, but it's an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing engagement that we can have. And eventually, you know, it becomes our lifestyle, right? And we just engage with the external things that make us uncomfortable, and we engage with the internal things that are uncomfortable and welcome them and accept all of them, you know. And then it's like, and then develop the discernment to move towards love and harmony with everybody else. Because harmony is not us all doing the same thing. It's us doing different things in a way that works together.
Yeah, I like that. I think if our theme for today, main takeaway, I think, and it runs through most of what we talked about, is this paradox of duality, non-duality, polar opposites, and the necessity of both, but engaging on a conscious level to exert a flow towards love more so than the polar opposite of Armageddon or just self-destruction. So yeah, I think that's great. I think we've covered.
And even not having judgment towards the destruction, knowing that it's all part of the totality of being that is universal love and creativity.
It's all love, man. Even the self-destruction is still love.
Yeah. And everything serves the love.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Scott. I want to say I appreciate you again.
Yeah, thank you.
For coming on the show. It was an amazing conversation today.
Yeah, it was fun.
Really glad that the technology worked in our favor today, and it's awesome to connect with you halfway across the world. I know it's later in the evening for you, and it's only just the beginning of my day today, so you're ahead of me a little bit on that. So yeah, until next time, we'll definitely have you back on. So thanks.
Sounds good.
Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.